At that point, I started Titan's engine, that intense thrumming roaring to life, feeling the vibrations flowing through the motorcycle, right into the handlebars and the seat. Okay, let her rip, Danny said as I throttled the engine to max, taking off, peeling out, leaving a cloud of smoke billowing behind me as the wheels spun in place for a while. The new wheels were actually pretty nice. It was a new design. Normal tires were just so prone to deflation from damage. Having everything suspended on air was simply not effective in combat. So, Danny developed a system. The exterior tires were essentially metallic plates with a rubber-like substance that simply coated the outside of them, being held in place by a magnetic field. So them getting hit with bullets didn't really affect them. Even if it punctured through, it wouldn't do any serious damage. Everything would still function properly. But seeing as the plates themselves were made out of that special metal, the same as most of the rest of Titan, excluding the armor from the XPC, which was simply too good to replace, being that it was advanced armor with shock-absorbing capabilities and a very pre-programmable nature that could adapt or change depending. They were simply too good to replace, with a simple base metal that couldn't do any of those things, even if it was incredibly strong. Regardless, at this point, they were working fine as I bolted forward on the racetrack, my speed picking up rapidly, thanks to Titan's new upgrades, including some upgrades to the overall engine layout that boosted power transfer rate, acceleration, horsepower, by a fairly decent amount as well. I was even faster than before, even with all of the extra armor and weaponry, and none of my maneuverability went anywhere. My heart pounded in my chest. It's time. I could see the visual cue for the rocket sword displayed in my vision. All it took was a thought to activate the programs that made it function. And with that, Titan's physical body began to shift and change. The exterior armor plates moving, the body frame extending and manipulating, even the handlebars I was gripping onto changing, rearranging themselves. Titan's body beginning to extend out as my secondary portion that carried me began to attach itself to me while dislodging from the central chain that held it all together. All the while, my grip on the handlebars, controlling my placement in this insane and, quite frankly, awesome shifting of metal and instruments. All the while, our forward momentum never stopping. Hell, we were even still picking up speed as we began to approach the test dummy section, and the transformation finally completed itself. The handlebars coming together, forming what amounted to a large handle as it pushed me further to the side of the motorcycle, and with a firm pull of the trigger, the complete separation finally took place. The blade was massive, but in order to make sure that it would function in Titan's form properly, it had to be made out of segments rather than an individual solid piece. These segments would simply attach to each other during the transformation process to form a long, solid blade. And as I pulled the trigger, lifting the blade, the jets from Titan kicked off. The massive blade spun to life, Titan's core armored and glowing, at a central point in the blade, that blue glow emanating from it as those massive metallic teeth spun wildly on the outside edge of the blade, the engine firmly setting itself right above what you might call the edge of the handle, creating somewhat of a hilt, perhaps. The jets holding the blade aloft, firing off at max capacity. I mean, I could somewhat feel the immensity of what I was swinging, but the jets made it possible. And as I approached the first target, I slashed out, revving the primary engine, forcing the blades to spin as fast as they could as they ripped their way through two cars stacked in a pyramid. The sound of tearing metal and grinding steel seemed to be the only thing I could hear at all as the sparks flew by, tiny pieces of metal bouncing off of the defensive barrier that the base I was riding still projected for my own protection. And the front half of both of the cars that I slashed into went sailing, along with the bottoms rolling across the ground somewhat, in a flurry of flying steel parts and bits separating. If there was gas in those engines, they definitely would have went up. But in no time at all, the next slash target was up. My blade was still on the opposite side. I had to give it a complete whirl around and swing in the opposite direction, the base below me spinning along with it, giving me the extra momentum I needed to slash through the secondary set of test dummies. And the same result. The blade tore right through them, shattering metal and tearing steel, flying everywhere as I rolled forward rapidly, one section of targets after another, getting slashed to pieces, seemingly with no issue at all. The blade was cutting through them entirely, like they were barely even there. Some cars were still set up normally, sitting as if they were driving close to the side of the track. Slashing through them was just as easy. The entire top half of the cars would come flying off. If I looked closely, I could even see the top half of the engines in the cars separating. Chunks of steel, some more than a foot thick, being torn through like tissue paper. Sparks and metal flying everywhere. And as I finally reached the edge of the track, they had pulled a large semi with steel pipes, very sizable ones, strapped to the back, blocking the edge of the track. It was meant to be, well, this is the end type thing. Simply a notice that the test track was complete and that I should stop. But for whatever the reason being, maybe I was just amped up, overcharged from the thrill of swinging around this massive blade, of feeling like I could tear through just about anything. But I saw the back of that semi loaded up with those massive steel pipes, and something compelled me to keep going, to make one last cut. There was a car nearby. Using it as sort of a jumping off point, I ramped up it with the system that was carrying me, directing the jets holding the blade aloft to go full force, blasting off with everything they had, actually lifting me up, mixing that with the bounce off of that car to the side of the road, and I was airborne, being held aloft by a blade powered by rockets as I flipped over the central segment containing those massive steel pipes below me. I flipped the jets into reverse, forcing the blades swing back downward, arcing around in a massive circle, the blades of the rocket sword spinning at max speed as I flew over, slashing into those gigantic steel pipes. Once again, the steel, the sparks, the feeling of the impact as the blade tore through it. These were actually exceptionally thick. It was much more difficult than I initially anticipated to tear through them, but the rocket sword did it anyways. And in that moment, I tore that semi in half, steel parts flying off, the semi itself collapsing in on itself as the pipes, jostled by this massive impact, snapped the cables holding them in place and began to roll off. I, on the other hand, had just done an airborne rotation, landing on the other side, spinning around, hitting the brakes, coming to a complete stop as I gave the order for Titan's body to begin the reforming process. And as everything began to pull itself back together, all I could do was look at the track, all of those slashed to ribbons cars, and that semi cut in half as everything finally took its proper place in the motorcycle. I have to say, I hadn't felt that good in years. In fact, that might just be the most epic thing I have ever done, and I cannot wait to do it again.